Central Park 5 by Mosaid, Robert, and Diana. Injustices amongst us today. Unjust acts attributed by the criminal justice system are spotlighted all over the media. Everywhere you look, the TV, the newspaper, or even your phone, it's hard not to come face to face with the reality that sometimes our justice system is wrong. This idea of error has permeated the criminal justice system for a long time, and as for one group of people, a collective identity, the idea of injustice has only exemplified, bloomed in recent years. For African Americans, enjoying a normal life is not an easy luxury. Regardless of socioeconomic reasonings, there is still a much larger social issue. African Americans have become the targeted victims of racial profiling. According to the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, racial profiling occurs when law enforcement targets individuals of color with abrasive interrogations, jarring detentions, and unwarranted searches without any evidence of criminal activity, all simply based on their perceived race, ethnicity, etc. This notion has not only corrupted the criminal justice system on a local level, but this terrifying, almost dystopian concept has created a media bias against the black population. An unfortunate viewpoint that has not only affected police officers on their shifts, but a perception that has now infiltrated the living rooms of neighbors alike. Today, the African American community makes up 14% of the entire population in America. As well, in recent years, from a polarizing statistic, the African American community makes up over half, 50% of the entire prison population in America. A massive disparity that is only growing larger with the issue of racial profiling in the criminal justice program. Highlighting this injustice, this video is going to shine a light on the Central Park 5 case, a case that has grown in popularity in recent years. This case being a watershed moment for justice, racial profiling, and the cruel ability of the criminal justice system's power in shaping a narrative. Along with an in-depth exploration of this case and its effects, this video will provide possible solutions, reconciliations, for the future of our justice system. The case begins with the incident that occurred on April 19, 1989, where Tricia Ellen Melly decided to go on a run in Central Park, where at the time, numerous reports of African Americans causing violence were being made. On April 19, 1989, 28-year-old investment banker Tricia Ellen Melly went running through Central Park at night. A night from records compiled outlined as so. Melly left for her run around 9 p.m., where she kept a steady 8-minute mile pace into the park. Around 9:15, Melly was attacked physically. It is at this point in the night she was dragged off the road, assaulted, and raped. All while the night continued. A night in Central Park filled with other violence ensuing. Wilding, as it was later called by the teens and media. A byproduct of the constant racial tension between whites and minorities, in which random acts of violence against one another increased. And as for April 19, 1989, an unfortunate night for a run, numerous reports of 30 to 40 black teens wilding were being made. A violent spree against unsuspecting joggers and homeless citizens alike. A night for the wounds of oppression to open and the fists of vengeance to close. This violence went on for hours into the next, where Tricia Melly was eventually found next to a muddy ravine in the early hours of April 20th, 1989, barely alive from the wounds that spotlighted her, a fractured skull, a crushed eye socket, and blood. Blood that would go on to be binding a pact, a connection, that, however, would not favor the lives of 5 boys who hung around Central Park that night. From the reports of wilding, the police were able to arrest 5 young boys from Harlem: Antron McCrae, Kevin Richardson, Yusuf Salem, Raymond Santana, and Corey Wise. In custody and not related to the Melly case at the time, officers pressed the boys about their actions the previous night through forcible questioning. Although, with the recent discovery of Melly and the ambiguity of the events, the officers turned their focus on the boys in custody. 5 boys that, in the eyes of the police, looked like an easy target to peg this crime on. Indicated from reports, a Clarence Thomas and a Steve Lopez were also arrested at the time. However, Thomas was spared from the case, and Lopez pleaded guilty to another crime that occurred that night in Central Park. Although, for the 5 boys, officers and detectives could see the potential for a small sense of clarity to the large ambiguity of the night. At the police station, all 5 boys were separated and put through an emotional gauntlet of questioning. Overseen by Linda Fairstein, the district attorney working on the case, detectives used coercion to force a confession from each of the 5 boys. Being careful with what evidence they had on the case, which was only DNA that didn't match the boys', Fairstein quickly realized that a verdict of guilt would only be probable pending verbal confessions from the boys. In those questioning rooms, where detectives sat with the boys, they brutally manipulated them into accepting guilt for a crime they didn't commit. Knowing the age of the suspects, the detectives used their fear and their ignorance of the law against them. Fairstein also did not allow for the boys' parents or guardians to be with them, furthering a state of terror within the boys. A state of terror which detectives slowly turned into paranoia. Using their manipulation strategies, detectives slowly turned the boys on each other, claiming that one or another had already confessed and told them the truth. From an interview recalling the injustice in their conviction, Kevin Richardson went on to relay the grueling and relentless questioning he endured. Manipulated into thinking his friends accepted their verdicts, Richardson claimed that at the time the detectives told him that all this would stop if he just simply complied. A compliance in the eyes of a 15-year-old at the time didn't know would go on to place him behind iron bars for more than 5 years. However, with the questioning finally over, and each boy delivering an incriminating confession, Fairstein had everything she needed for a successful trial. However, before we move on to the trials, it's important to note how unjust this case really was. On the basis of coercion, if we take a closer look into one of the confessions of the boys, we can see how manipulative a corporate criminal justice system can be. The confessions were eventually agreed upon by both the detectives and the boys. However, in the court of law, a recorded confession would go a long way in solidifying the guilty verdict for the boys. From Fairstein's team, she appointed Elizabeth Lederer, the assistant district attorney, to hold the questioning for the boys' confession. Highlighted from the actual video of Corey Wise's confession, we can see the unjust manipulation of her questioning. Off the bat, we see a manipulation happening with Corey's words to really incriminate him. Lederer begins by showing a photo of Melly and asking the boy how she received her wounds. Nervous, or perhaps due to a lack of preparation on everyone's part, he goes on to say that a knife caused them, which, for the case of Melly's wounds, doesn't really add up. The wounds she received were caused by a rock, a bludgeon weapon. Lederer highlights the inconsistency and forcibly makes it known for Corey to change his answer, which he does. Lederer then goes on to ask Corey about the people involved during the attack. Corey states in the confession that he saw no faces when the body of Melly was being moved. After stating that, though, Lederer is quick to use his confession to rule out any other possible names that were in the park that night. Not people like Kevin or Raymond Santana, Lederer asks Wise in the clip. Throughout Corey's almost 2-hour confession, it's leading questions like these that really highlight an injustice in this case. The injustice in the ability of the criminal justice system to play writer, editor, and publisher. And although they had confessed on videotape, 4 of the boys quickly went on to retract their statements. Together, as a collective voice, they exposed the detectives and the prosecution for having been lied to, intimidated, and forced into making these confessions. However, the trials were set, and all the boys could do was hope that the jury would find mercy in their deliberations. Deliberations, however, guided by a lack of evidence, yet a bountiful bias, furthered by the media, that would forever change the lives of these 5 boys. Referred to as the Wolf Pack in the news and media, these 5 boys went into their court cases with the whole world seemingly against them. This general bias carried well into the court trials, the first of which, from June 25th to August 18th of 1990, landed each of the boys, Antron, Yusef, and Raymond, the maximum sentence for juveniles, 5 to 10 years in a youth correctional facility. Now, it's important that we note how the prosecution carefully and methodically separated this case into 2 trials. With the first trial sharing preliminary evidence, it was the confession of Corey Wise in the second trial, led by a laser-focused letterer, that really solidified the guilty verdict for each of the boys. With a lack of concrete evidence placing them at the scene of the crime, it was the words from their coerced confessions that sealed their fates. All of the boys were found guilty, and each of them, they were sentenced. For Yusuf Salem, he served nearly 7 years. For Kevin Richardson, he served 5 years. For Raymond Santana, he also served 5 years. For Antron McCrae, he served 6. And as for Corey Wise, he served 12. Time lost in prison, not only just due to the injustice of a corrupt criminal justice system, but the hesitant confession of Tricia Ellen Melly's actual attacker, Matthias Reyes, a serial rapist whose semen forensic scientists confirmed as a DNA match in Melly's case. Once the truth was finally out all those years later, the boys were eventually released from their cages and allowed to walk the earth, now, finally, unchained. Years after the revelation, the boys sued the system for restitution, and after many, many years of the guilty parties avoiding the case, refusing a settlement in 2003, a recent settlement for $40 million was finally reached in 2014, with each member of the so-called Wolf Pack receiving their share. However, no matter the monetary restitution, psychologically, these 5 boys would never be the same, all due to the injustice of a corrupt criminal justice system that preyed upon 5 black boys who would come to be known as the Central Park 5. Lucky enough for the criminal justice system, many changes have been made to the idea of questioning minors. In fact, many protective actions were put in place to protect minors from facing unjust questioning. From cases like the Central Park 5, it was decided in court that juveniles are supposed to be afforded greater protection during questioning than adults because they are thought to be inherently more susceptible to psychological pressure from adults, especially authority figures, including police officers. Essentially, the right for another adult in the room for the sake of the minor and fair questioning was set forth. In fact, the U.S. Supreme Court broadened this notion to schools, a place where many students feel as if they must obey with questioning, given the disciplinary nature of the institution. Now, what needs to happen for the injustice to become just is simply more awareness. We need the recording of interrogations and other processes within the criminal justice system. This will allow for more transparency. I am not implying making society a dystopia, but when it comes to officials with privileges that could hold the lives of citizens in their hands, there should be as many factors to protect both parties. Now, many other devices over time set forth a solution to the injustice of altering narratives as well, for example, body cams. However, the real solution to the injustice faced in this case is, well, something that this country will really have to reflect on in the oncoming years. And that issue is being racism. It almost seems that Black Americans and law enforcement seem to be engaged in an unnecessary civil war, with blood being shed on the home front daily. Now, racial profiling may not have been the only reason these boys were apprehended, but given the context of the violence that occurred in Central Park that night, many years ago, transparency could say that it was the byproduct of racism. A shameful idea that will continue to corrupt the criminal justice system for however long it continues to fester, infect, and reproduce.